This week on Oasis by the Sea, Pastor Keith teaches Always Ready from the book of 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 8 to 16.
Something that often happens to me when I'm preaching, preparing for preaching, I should tell you, and that is that God doesn't ever let me off easy. If there's something in the text that you have to experience, He often makes me experience it just as I'm preparing. Just so that I'm compassionate and understanding, and that I've had to apply it to me before I ask anyone else to apply it to them. And we're going to be talking this week about hope, and not just having a hope, but other people noticing that you have a hope. There's a difference between having a hope and other people noticing you have a hope. And this has been a tough week for me, for other people to notice my hope. This has been not my easiest week of projecting and shining and happy glowy face. This has not been my best week for that. Which means this speaks to me just as much as it speaks to anybody else this week. Anything I'm saying to you, I had to say to me first. And there were things that I had to hear in this passage. We've been in 1 Peter for a bit. We're in 1 Peter chapter 3. We've been talking for a while now in 1 Peter, and it's a challenging book. I told my wife, I've never heard anyone speak from 1 Peter, and I've never preached from 1 Peter, and now I know why. Because there is a lot of super challenging stuff in this book. Last week I finished up with verse 8, and we're going to start with the same verse that I finished up with last week. To sum up, to summarize, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. Peter is summing up this section, and this section starts in chapter 2, verse 11. So he's summing up quite a large chunk. He's written about how to deal with difficult government when his government, the government that Peter was under, was imprisoning Paul for being a Christian. He talked about how to deal with a difficult government, and this government would kill Peter for his faith within 10 years. He's talking about how to deal with a difficult government, and that government that he's talking about will sack Jerusalem, and millions of people will die within 10 years. If you think you have a difficult government, you are way short on understanding difficult government. Nobody in this room has experienced the kind of government that Peter was talking about. And yet he talked about being submissive and working with that government. He talked about how to deal with being a slave. Yet another fairly hypothetical thought for anybody in this room, actually being a slave. And being a slave in a culture where you didn't have any protections, that your boss could come home and because they'd had a bad day, they could beat you for it. That is a rough situation. And then he talked about husbands and wives. And he talked about husbands and wives in a culture where wives were somewhere between slave and citizen, often treated like property. He's talked about how to live and react well in some of the worst, pretty much the worst circumstances he could have picked from his world. He looked out throughout his culture and said, what are the hardest things I could pick? And he picked those and said, these are the situations you have to be godly in. You have to be godly in the worst things I can find. That's hard words. That's hard stuff. That's not the sort of stuff we love to hear. Now, the truth is I've shown this a couple times, but this is only the first half of the sentence. The second half of the sentence is in the next verse. So let's put up the whole sentence. To sum up, let all be harmonious, sympathetic, brotherly, kind-hearted, and humble in spirit. And he's talking about that in terms of these very difficult situations. Not returning evil for evil, or insult for insult, but giving a blessing instead, for you are called for the very purpose that you might inherit a blessing. That's an interesting phrase. Why does Peter write it that way? He starts with, give a blessing, but he calls it because you are called to receive a blessing. It's a very specific way of writing that. How does that follow? one of the things that I talk about frequently is that we can only give what we have. You can't give what you don't have. Before I knew that Christine was going to do something for the children, I was going to make this example of asking I was going to hold a stuffed animal. And then I was going to tell one of the other kids to give one of the kids the stuffed animal, which of course they can't do if they don't have it. And then I was going to hand them the stuffed animal and say, look, I've given it to you, and then they could give because they had. Where does our blessing to others come from? How are we able to bless others when they are mean to us and when they act like our enemy? And here's how. See, while I was acting like God's enemy, God blessed me with an invitation to join his family. See, I'm supposed to treat other people the way that God treated me first. Now, all I'm supposed to do is pass on what I received. Only someone who has received what they do not deserve can give away what other people don't deserve. And if you're wondering what this Christian thing is about, maybe you're new to this whole Christian thing, and you're wondering when the rule book is going to come down. Like, okay, I've signed up for this thing, when am I going to get the rules? Okay, that's not what happens. Here's what it's about. You receive something amazing, and then you're supposed to give other people stuff that's amazing, because you got that first. And that's it. This is what Christianity is about. Christianity is a receiving what we don't deserve, and then in turn giving what other people don't deserve. That's it. I mean, as far as the life, as far as the focus, as far as the flow goes, this is it. God isn't expecting us to give away what we don't have. He's asking us to share what we have an abundance of. The grace. Grace is a fancy church word for getting things you don't deserve. Grace, that's what grace means. Getting things you don't deserve. We're supposed to get so much grace that we have excess. I talk about Bible reading and prayer. Bible reading, prayer, Bible reading, prayer. Every pastor who's ever lived talks about Bible reading and prayer. Why? Okay, it's through Bible reading and prayer that we get and understand the blessing. See, I don't understand how God's blessed me until I go and read about it. And I need to read about it a lot because I forget and I don't understand it. And I need to be reminded. And I read this book and I go, wow, look at how God has blessed me. And I get it because I read it. Or I pray, and in my prayer God responds and he speaks to my spirit. And I realize he's heard me, and it's a two-way communication. If you don't understand that prayer can be a two-way communication, we should talk. And so we talk about prayer, we talk about Bible reading, because if you're not doing that, you're not getting the blessing, and so you have nothing to give away. You have nothing to pass on if you haven't received first. And that's how we receive. And so that's why we're harping on it. It's not because we want to make robots that all read their Bibles and pray, because we're all supposed to do the same thing. It's that, no. You can't get it if you don't do this stuff. You don't receive the blessing and the grace that you desperately need if you're not doing these basic things. And so he starts with this principle that we're supposed to pass on a blessing because we've received. That's where he starts. And now he's going to move on to something else. The next thing that Peter is going to do is he's going to support his words with a quote from the book of Psalms. If you don't understand the book of Psalms, it's a songbook. So Psalms just means songs, and each chapter is a different song. So it's kind of a funny book. It's a little bit different than most. Each chapter is completely separate from the one before it. It's a completely different song. And the King David, if you know who David is, David and Goliath, okay. He wrote a lot of them. He wrote a lot of the Psalms. And this is one of those ones. He's going to specifically quote Psalm 34. It's a song of David. And it's a song that David wrote about his time in the court of Abimelech. Most of you probably do not know a clue of who Abimelech is, and that is fine. But you might know the name Goliath. Almost everybody knows the whole David-Goliath thing. David, the kid with the sling, and then Goliath, the big tall guy, and they had a fight and David wins. Abimelech was the king of the place where Goliath was born. So Goliath was born in the place where Abimelech is king. So here's the scene. This is the song. So David's written a song about he's running from his own king. His name is Saul. He's just running. And he's run from place to place because Saul's just chasing him. And he's just like randomly going everywhere, trying to stay alive. And in his randomly running everywhere, trying to stay alive, he ends up in the hometown of his most famous enemy. Like he's famous back then for it too. He's in the town of his most famous enemy. And he's wrote a song about that time. And the quote that we read next is from that song. So let's kind of read that song. This is from 1 Peter 8, 10 through 12. This is Peter's song about this time in this court. Let him who means to love life and see good days. See, David was fearing for his life right then. It was a very high probability in David's mind he was not going to get out of there alive. When he talks about good life and long life, he literally means, I was staring death in the face and I was wondering how I was going to get out of this alive. That's where David's at when he writes this. But him who means to love life and see good days, refrain his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking guile. Guile is evil, disgusting things. And so he's in the court of Abimelech, and he's got some, I imagine he might have had some choice words he would have liked to have spoken to King. No. Nope. He's going to hold his tongue. He's going to keep his mouth shut. And let him turn away from evil and do good. Let him seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. David was a man who God sometimes chose to judge other nations. He was one of those special people in the Bible that occasionally it was his job to bring God's wrath to a place like that. David did that. You know when he did that? When God told him to do that. You know what God hadn't said? Do that. See, this wasn't the time. This wasn't the time or the place for him to act as a judge or God's wrath. That wasn't the time. He's just running from his life. And he doesn't make it his job to do that. You know, if anybody in all of history of people who believed in God could have just assumed that it was their job to bring judgment upon people because God used them to do that all the time, it might have been King David, because he got that job a lot. Yet despite the fact that he got that job a lot, he didn't do it when he wasn't told to. And so this is his prayer and his attitude in that court. He commends the whole situation to God. Verse 12, God is watching me. God hears my prayer. If evil needs to be dealt with, God will do it. It doesn't need to be me. See, this is exactly the sort of attitude and thoughts we have to see and understand when we're in the tough situation. When we're in the hard situation, when we're being treated badly. This is exactly the sort of thing that David is in the midst of, and it's exactly the sort of thing we need. I'm in this tough situation, and I need to act in a way that pursues peace and refrains from speaking guile. And I'm going to trust that God has this, and he can punish who he chooses to punish. Having said all that, I'm going to, very quickly, I'm going to do a Bible geek moment. If you're a normal human being, you can take a 30-second nap. But if you're an actual Bible geek, I just want to say a few things. This passage here in your Bible has been translated twice. It's been translated from ancient Hebrew to Greek and then Greek to English. And then if we go to the Psalms passage, it's only been done from English or ancient Hebrew to English. It is one of the best examples of what double translation versus single translation looks like in the entire Bible. It's considered one of the best spots to analyze that thing. And if you're interested in that kind of topic, you should look at that because it's a really cool study. Okay, all the rest of you can wake up now, because I know that was pretty nerdy. Okay, we'll move on. The psalm that Peter just quoted, was a time of very real fear for David. So much so that this is how David got out of that situation, if you don't know the story. He pretended to go mad and banged his head against the wall of the court so that they let him go. That's how afraid David was in that circumstance. He was terrified. And Peter transitions from an account of real fear to a promise about fear. Let's look at verses 13 and 14. And who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. Do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. Next slide. What obedience have we missed because we were afraid of doing good? I think we can all relate to that question, and if you can't, I can. I've been in moments where I came home after a circumstance, and I knew what I was supposed to do. I knew what I was supposed to say. I knew how I was supposed to act, and I didn't because I was afraid. That's happened to me. I'm not going to tell you it hasn't. I'm not going to stand up here and try to be some example I'm not. Fear is one of the great enemies that stands between us and our witness. Fear is one of the great enemies that stands between us and making an impact in our world and having a positive and being and doing what we're supposed to do. And Peter knows it. And he's pointing his finger in our chest. And he says, don't. Don't let fear be the thing that stops you from doing the thing. Don't do it. So what's the worst that can happen? Because if you really are doing good and you really are showing love, chances are no one's going to get mad at that. And then even if they do we not trust God enough? That's a hard statement. It's a very real one. There are people in this room today who have become accustomed to a risk level that would make many of us nervous. I'm not pointing them out, but I've watched them do it over the last week. They live and they risk as far as sharing who they are that is a little edgy for me. I'm not trying to magnify them. Some of the boldest people I know would seem in an earthly sense to have very little. And yet there is an intense, amazing blessing in being a person willing to suffer if that's what it takes to do what is good. There's a lot of power in that. We're going to talk about that power. From here, Peter makes it clear what the highest and best and most important good is that we can possibly do. This is 1 Peter 3:15. It's one of those verses that if you've been a Christian a long time, you've probably been exposed to at some point. Let's look at 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Not ego and judgment and superiority complex. It's not up there. It's not up there. In this discussion about living in unfair situations, Peter says we should have a hope so obvious that it invites questions. I'm just going to tell you there are more than one way to witness. Lots of good ones. I've been around long enough to get lots of instruction about different ways to witness. This way is a very specific way, and this way is about being something that invites a question. That's this method. So here's our new question that we need to ask. Next slide. Is our unfair situation meant to showcase our hope? Let me explain that. If my life is perfect and I have hope, doesn't that seem appropriate? What's surprising about that? Isn't it understandable? Of course you have hope. Look at your perfect life. Why wouldn't you have hope? See, it doesn't show, it doesn't glow, it's not popping. There's nothing particularly amazing about having hope if my life is super awesome. But if our circumstances are brutal, if trials surround us, if unfairness clings to us like a wet t-shirt, and we still have hope, now there's something to talk about. Now there's something worth explaining, worth asking about, something attention-getting. Because if your life is garbage and yet hope is glowing out of it anyway, that's going to get some attention. That's going to draw. See, is our unfair circumstance the black backdrop that our light of hope could go whoosh in contrast? And do we see our unfair circumstances as that? Do we see that there's an opportunity in what is difficult to show a witness of power of what it really means to have God in our life? Do we recognize that it's an opportunity, or are we so drowned out by the fact that it's uncomfortable that we never get to the fact that? What are we doing with that? Next slide. Do we have a hope worth asking about? And could we explain it if we were asked? This way of evangelism, this way of sharing, it starts with having a hope that draws attention. It starts with living a life that confuses people. And then when the people around us are compelled to ask, how can you maintain such a hope in the face of so much difficulty? Then there's an answer that satisfies. And what is the answer that satisfies? How about something like this? You're right. My life is terribly unfair, but not in the way you think. My life is utterly unfair. I made horrible mistakes. I was unworthy of God's love. I deserved punishment beyond imagining, but God paid my price by sacrificing his son, by killing a perfect man so that I can be set free. And now, I have inherited eternal, abundant, fulfilling life. The Holy Spirit empowering me, Christ as a brother, God as my Father. I can't begin to tell you how unfair my life is, but it's the opposite of what you think. It's the opposite of what you think. It doesn't matter what you think is around me that's unfair. I know my life is unfair, as in I do not deserve what I've been given. And remember, that's what grace means. Grace means receiving what we haven't deserved. And that means we live in a constant state of unfairness. Positive unfairness. If we are constant recipients of grace, then we are constant recipients of what isn't fair. And when we glow in that, and when we can answer that, and when we realize whatever can happen to me here is so paltry and small and puny compared to what God has given me that I never deserved. And when we start to compare those things, then we have a hope. We have a hope. We have a hope that goes, and it can't be understood or explained. Last verse 16. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. It's interesting that this is the second time he said this almost exact thing in his letter. When we have repeated things, there's a reason it gets repeated. This comes up in chapter 2, verse 12. He writes almost exactly the same thing. Look, we cannot keep people from talking bad about us. I can't keep people from talking bad about me. You can't stop people from talking bad about you. Here's the only thing we can do. We can keep them from being right. We can make them liars. We can live in such a way that the bad things they say are ridiculous. We can live in such a way that everyone in town knows that the bad things they say are ridiculous. That's the power of a good reputation. We can live in such a way that, okay, say stuff if you want, but who's going to listen? We can do that. And this is important. See, here's the thing. If we're actually living in a way that when people revile us, it's justified, you know what we've done? We've just ruined all the rest of the process. We had an unfair situation, and we had hope, and now it's lovely, and we had a witness, except our life is garbage, and it just taints and sours and dirties everything that we just tried to do. Because what's coming out of us overshadows. When our life actions are broken and disgusting and worldly, then it smears mud all over the witness, and all that stuff that could have been so amazing loses its impact. So let's put it all together. Oh, here we go. Let's do that last slide. That's fine. Put it back up. Be careful not to damage the witness that the unfair trial was supposed to create. Be careful that you didn't just endure that unfair thing really well, but then ruin it with a bad witness, and now it's just lost. Like, it's kind of wasted. So let's not do that. So let's go on to the summary. Here's some ideas and principles from what we've read today. First of all, we need to receive God's grace. We need to receive it the first time. We need to keep receiving it. We need to be in a constant absorption of God's grace. We do that primarily by staying in His Word and staying in prayer and being exposed. And if we're never paying any attention to God, how are we going to be basking in His grace? How does that work? We can't not spend time with God and get that. So we need to be receiving something that we can get. And then we need to be bold in passing that grace on. Then when the unfair situations come, we need to know right away that that's an opportunity to showcase unreasonable hope. It's an opportunity to demonstrate something that cannot be explained. So we need a hope that's worth asking about. And then when the question comes, we need to be ready for an answer, with an answer of what that hope is. And lastly, let's not ruin the opportunity by making mistakes in our lives that overshadow and cloud and dirty all that this has been done and have a witness. I think that's harder to do than to say. I started this sermon by telling you that I struggled this week. I struggled this week doing this. I don't think I hit all the points this week. I got stuff to work on. It's okay if you have stuff to work on. In fact, please look at this and don't just go, oh, that's a nice list. Please look at this and do what I'm having to do right now, which is, where do I need to work next? Where in that list of things where in that progression am I at? What do I need to be working on next? Maybe it's at the very beginning. Maybe you need to receive God's grace. Like maybe you're just you haven't had that yet. We had a lovely description of what that was. We had a prayer where you were invited to pray to receive God's grace. If you did that, I'm so excited. We need to learn not to just have a moment of grace. We need to live in a life of grace, and we need training to do that. So come talk. But wherever it is that you realize you're at, talk to God and make a plan and make a decision right now about where it is you need to move, where you need to grow. Let's pray.
You've been listening to Oasis by the Sea. Thank you so much for joining us today. May God richly bless you until we see you next week at the Oasis.